Christopher Marlowe is one of history's greatest enigmas. Much of what is known about him comes from evidence for other people, and that we do know has been interpreted very differently at different times. To his contemporaries, Marlowe was a great playwright, an atheist, and person of questionable morals. To later Victorians wanting to enjoy his plays, Marlowe was transformed into a palatable artist, only working through his excesses in pursuit of the unreachable truth, and any moral failings were excused in light of his literary genius. To historians in the later 20th century, Marlowe's failings instead became the focus, bringing him down from the echelons of genius playwright to ordinary flawed man complete with a criminal history. So, who was the real Marlowe? Marlowe's life begins in the poverty-stricken depths of Canterbury, born in the shadow of the nearby abattoir and carts of the condemned travelling through to the gallows. His parents were both migrants to the city. His father, John Marlowe, had travelled from near Faversham in Kent and was a shoemaker, and his mother, Catherine Arthur, had come from Dover. Marlowe was the second child born to his parents of 9 children altogether, and was baptised on the 26th of February 1564. He was born during a period in which English religion had gone through Henry VIII's personal version of Catholicism, Edward VI's unrelenting Protestantism, the fiery return to the Catholic faith by Mary I, and finally Elizabeth I's more moderate attempt to balance both sides of the Christian argument in England. The clergy had learned to roll with whatever changes came in order to survive, and those who clung steadfast to their chosen morals could be on trend one week and dead the next. In 1596, Christopher's father was fined for not coming to church as he was supposed to, and it's likely John, probably like many others at the time, now held a cynical view of religion alongside those who became more devout in the face of religious change. This shifting, shallow childhood experience of religion would have a great effect on the young Marlowe, and influenced his view of it as an adult. However, a few weeks after Christopher's birth, his father's master died, and the city admitted John Marlowe from an apprentice to a fully fledged shoemaker into its guild, 3 years earlier than he should have been. He was now able to hoist his family up to the lower middle classes, and this would have improved their lives considerably. John was also notably able to read and write, a skill that was highly unusual a century before in anyone who wasn't nobility. But thanks to Henry VIII's insistence that parents teach their children how to read certain biblical texts such as the Lord's Prayer, many more people in the lower classes were now at least marginally literate. However, being able to write was more difficult, and this allowed John to compete for clerk's positions, a job that paid far better than cobbling. No doubt Christopher not only saw how writing could fuel a better career, but also that it was a powerful tool for social mobility. Despite having 8 other siblings, only 5 would survive beyond childhood, including Christopher himself. Catherine and John were no different to other couples of the time, seeing a large family as a way to have more workers both in and out of the home, to marry them to someone who would improve their financial and social standing, and as a buffer against old age. However, Christopher was the only boy in his family who survived, and after his elder sister Mary died when he was 4, he also became the eldest child. While he would have been expected to help with some tasks such as fishing, studying his father's work, or learning to use a bow, his 4 sisters would have been expected to do the household chores, a pattern that would remain for centuries afterwards. Not being needed for chores, combined with his father's improved job prospects and financial situation, meant young Marlowe was able to go to school. At around the age of 6, he would have attended a local petty school, which in reality could be the front room of a house where several children would pay a penny or so to a housewife, or it might be in a more ecclesiastical setting where the local minister would provide rudimentary education as well. Children in petty schools would learn reading and writing almost exclusively with biblical texts. as the real reason for these schools was, in theory, to keep small, poor children out of trouble and make them learn about God instead of criminal activity. However, it was also possible the young Marlowe entered a free grammar school in Canterbury from the same age, one across the road from Eastbridge Hospital, as suggested by historian David Riggs, as there the pupils learned to sing as well as reading and writing with the new Reformation-led texts that expected children to think like classical philosophers of the past rather than Catholic saints. In later years, Marlowe would gain a scholarship to Cambridge that required students to be able to read music, something he wouldn't have learned in the local Petty school, so this connection does seem possible. By the age of 14 in 1578, Marlowe had won a scholarship to the King's School in Canterbury, and he had to work hard. It was a competitive environment that encouraged boys, as there were no girls in the grammar schools, to find fault in each other's work, and those who were deemed too slow for the work were expelled from school. There were 50 scholarships available, and so the headmaster's income was paid for out of fees by the fee-paying students known as commoners. A commoner could attempt to win a scholarship as soon as a boy was expelled or left for other reasons, and it's possible John Marlowe managed to gain entry for Christopher either as a fee-paying student or by instead bartering his skills as a shoemaker and providing shoes for the boys at the King's School. But in exchange for this hard work, the scholars did receive an annual stipend of £4, more than many families got at the time to live on, and they would eat good food such as beef and mutton, and enjoy taking part in Christmas plays as part of the school's traditions. No doubt this was where Marlowe first experienced the stage, albeit a small one, and might even have started thinking up later ideas for plays. By 1580, Christopher had won a scholarship to Cambridge University, with the view to becoming an Anglican priest. It was less money than his previous scholarship at £3, 6 shillings and sixpence a year, and when he arrived in December, the scholar he was there to replace was still at the university and would remain until the following May. However, the university's buttery book shows that Marlowe ate a good deal of very nice meals in the hall while at Cambridge, and he was enrolled as staying at Corpus Christi College, even though he hadn't actually been admitted yet. One explanation for this could be that the college chapel was still being built at that time, and students were often employed as labourers to help. These students would be paid with what were called exceedings, which could have been food in the main hall rather than money. When he was finally officially admitted in May 1581, Marlowe set to work studying Latin, and he would read and translate the works of Ovid, Virgil and Horace amongst other classical authors. It was also a place where Marlowe would have become acutely aware of his social standing. After spending several years at the top of his small pile as a privileged scholar in grammar school amongst the poorer children of his neighbourhood, Christopher was now rubbing shoulders with the sons of barons and earls. The sons of nobles were allowed to dress in much more ostentatious fashion than the common scholars, and were allowed to drink and party with their equally wealthy friends. Marlowe's jealousy and animosity towards this social inequality is clear in his later plays, where Dr. Faustus imagines what Mephistopheles can do for him and thinks about all the scholars at Cambridge being dressed in silk, or Tamburlaine sneaking into the aristocracy by donning a suit of armour. Marlowe would have shared a chamber with 3 other students, but the room would have been fairly devoid of the trappings of home, with a few chairs and a table and just 2 beds. In the Elizabethan period, across many people from different walks of life, bed sharing with the same sex was not only acceptable but expected. It allowed people to save up until they were married, to keep warm in the winter with what was likely minimal bedding, and at Cambridge and Oxford particularly, it became combined with friendship and learning. Within the new Latin texts from classical antiquity that Marlowe and his fellow students now studied, There were writings from Plato to Aristotle that touched upon a subject likely never really discussed in polite Elizabethan society, that of homoerotic love. It therefore may have been an environment in which students who were, due to the time they lived in, forced to hide their homosexuality, were able to recontextualize the ideas of caring about someone of the same sex against the constraining rules of the church. Within the walls of the universities, intense friendships between men, which could have been, for some, much more, was allowed, with the understanding of this being a love for the person, not their body. Tudor law had made sodomy a crime punishable by death, but in actual fact, very few people were ever convicted of the crime, even with evidence, due to the difficulty in seeing the difference between actual romantic homosexual love and friendly love between two non-romantic men. Marlowe is one of those over whom a question mark remains about his sexuality. He toyed with ideas about homosexuality in his plays. In Dido, Queen of Carthage, he opens the play with an erotically charged scene between Jupiter and his serving boy Ganymede that has no bearing or connection to the rest of the play at all. In Edward II, the first play ever written about the medieval king, Marlowe didn't hold back on showing Edward as a homosexual, but instead of showing him as a villain, he was sympathetic with the character. But we mustn't confuse how Elizabethans saw homosexuality with our modern understanding. They did not see a person as gay, but rather that there was an act of homosexuality. Someone could marry a woman, raise children, and commit an act of sodomy, but this did not make them homosexual. The concept simply didn't exist at the time for the average person. Had Marlowe lived longer, regardless of his sexuality, he could possibly have raised enough income to set up a home and married as well as had children. Even when Marlowe left Cambridge, his sleeping arrangements still included sleeping in a bed with a same-sex partner, and there is no hint of ever having shared with a woman. This suggests that unless he chose to be celibate, he would have only had an outlet for sexual desires with other men, leaving the idea of where Marlowe's true feelings were still a little nebulous. Whatever the case, it didn't interfere with Christopher's education, and in 1584, he was given his Bachelor of Arts degree. He won it by taking part in 4 disputations, twice defending an argument in Latin using the classical writers he had studied over the past few years, and twice as a questioner, arguing against others. The purpose of these arguments, unlike modern degrees, was not to find a deeper meaning to the argument or some truth from it, but simply to prove that those taking part were rational, intelligent, and understood how the arguments could be applied to counter other arguments, ad infinitum. Marlowe's scholarship now allowed him to stay on for another 3 years as a master's student if it was with the intent to go into the church. It would have been silly to turn it down. If Christopher really did go into a religious career or a job with the university, either would be enhanced by a master's, and if he didn't, the 3 years paid to study allowed him to look for something better. But in the first year of his new study, Marlowe began to take time away from his studies that turned into extremely long absences. Those who had completed their degrees were allowed more movement than undergraduates, but Christopher took the mickey with this, missing out about half the academic year by missing out whole terms at a time. His time at Cambridge was on and off until his last period there in March 1587. Where he might have been is a matter of huge debate. He is recorded in the summer of 1585 as being in Canterbury, acting as a witness to a widow connected with his family. His father John was also a witness. The widow had 4 witnesses for the reading of a will instead of just 2, but this was partly because of the fact that the will was contested. The other reason was that Marlowe could both read and write proficiently, and so he was able to work as a notary. In the eyes of those back home, Christopher had now become a writer. Others have debated that the reason for his absences might have been because Marlowe had started working for the Elizabethan government as a spy. In 1587, when Marlowe should have been awarded his master's degree with no issue, the university hesitated because there were rumours that he had plans to travel to the English seminary at Reims, France, to train as a Catholic priest. This was not only frowned upon, but was a criminal act. However, a strange event occurred in response to this. The Privy Council got involved. While the original letter is lost, minutes exist for the meeting about Marlowe's predicament. The Privy Council wrote to Cambridge and defended Marlowe against the rumours, stating rather cryptically that although he had travelled to France, in all his actions he had behaved himself orderly and discreetly, whereby he had done Her Majesty good service and deserved to be rewarded for his faithful dealing. And furthermore that it was not Her Majesty's pleasure that any employed as he had been in matters touching the benefit of his country should be defamed by those who are ignorant in the affairs he went about. This basically reads like a government helping cover up the dealings of one of its spies. And a certificate of allowance written up for another spy, John Edge, was worded in a very similar way. The wording is also almost deliberately vague, and most of all, why on earth would the Privy Council care about a random cobbler's son not getting his master's or being accused of being Catholic? It's possible he was either working in some capacity at Cambridge itself, where it was known that many students really were recruited to go to Reims, or he travelled to France with others. Further evidence for this again comes from his buttery accounts. During his absences in Marlowe's final 3 years at university, he received about half of his normal scholarship because he wasn't present enough, and yet his expenses show he was spending around 19 pence a week on food, far more than the 12 pence he would normally have received. It makes sense that he was being paid by the Elizabethan government. On top of this, many of those who attended university with Marlowe would also famously go on to work for the Elizabethan Secret Service. But 1587 was also the year Marlowe would make his theatrical debut. A few years before, he had already written Dido, Queen of Carthage, written specifically for a boy choir to perform, but by the time he left university, he had written out his first play that would be performed on a London stage, Tamburlaine the Great. It was based on a 14th century Tartar warlord named Timur-Ileng, and as mentioned earlier, Christopher used it as a base to include his feelings on the social structure of his day. The earliest known date for it being staged is the summer of 1587, not long after he had graduated. It was so successful that he hurriedly threw a sequel together, the second part of the bloody conquests of mighty Tamburlaine. But of course, there will always be those who are jealous of the success of others. And Marlowe's work came under fire from Robert Greene, who would in later years also complain bitterly about Shakespeare. He complained that the play was filled with blasphemy and that Tamburlaine himself was clearly an atheist. But Christopher would push this criticism further with another and possibly the most famous of his plays, Dr. Faustus. We don't actually know when exactly this play was written, and although it's recorded as being performed in September 1594 after Marlowe's death, it's highly probable it was performed before this date. In later years, another version would be published in 1616, although this version obviously had many other writers involved. The play dealt with many themes that would run through Marlowe's life, and was based on German stories about the character Faust, who was in turn based on a real alchemist named Johann Georg Faust. The play dealt with the title character, Dr. Faustus, an educated, successful man who is discontented with his life and so makes a deal with the devil. It was publicly a sort of warning against learning too much about religion, of how learning too much of the Bible without the guidance of a priest or other member of the church could lead to a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. It also dealt with themes surrounding magic and occultism in Elizabethan society, and how closely this danced with both emerging sciences and the fears of corrupting one's soul. Few writers had dared to touch on the demonic realm or spiritual matters at all before Marlowe's play, but there would be an increase after this point. But there were more hidden meanings than this, such as Marlowe once more showing his irritation at the treatment of those lower in the social hierarchy, with Faustus's comments about allowing all the scholars to wear silk. Most deliberately of all, Dr. Faustus uses the arguments of classical authors to question religion. All in all, Dr. Faustus is a wonderful example of Marlowe in one hit. It was an intelligent play that asked deep questions of its audience while still keeping it relatable. It showcased questions about religion in a way that was acceptable to a volatile Elizabethan crowd, and it held Christopher's personal feelings about many themes in his life. But these were far from Marlowe's only controversial works. He also penned The Jew of Malta in 1589, and once again, this play veered into the tricky subject of religious conflict. But this time, Marlowe seemed to hint towards feelings of antipathy towards religion in general, something which would later add to arguments of him being an atheist, as the Christians, Jews, and Muslims within the play are all portrayed as acting contrary to the principles of their chosen faiths. However, it is impossible to get away from the anti-Semitism of the play. Jewish people had been banished officially from England in 1290 and would not be officially readmitted until the 1650s. But many Jewish families continued to live and work in England, especially London, throughout this period, although they were only tolerated by Elizabethans if they stayed within their own communities. Therefore, writers like Marlowe would probably have had little actual interaction with anyone Jewish, and he, like others, would have relied instead on hurtful and derogatory stereotypes for his characters. Some scholars of Marlowe's work argue that he did not intend for the play to be anti-Semitic, but rather to use the Elizabethans' feelings about Jewish people as a way of trying to discredit these feelings, but that he failed at this. Others argue that the play contains many troubling details, but that these are little more than surface details for an audience to recognise, and the real message of the play was that all three religions are united in their hypocrisy. And others still argue that Marlowe was doing little more than repeating the widely held anti-Semitic views of his time, regardless of whether he personally held them or not. But why did Marlowe decide to go into the theatre at all? For us, it may seem more glamorous than the life of a parish minister, but in the 16th century, theatres were a fringe society. Theatres themselves were often badly built and run by slum landlords, who often also owned brothels surrounding the playhouses. People would go to see a play and also find a bedfellow for the evening that required payment. The theatre was seen as a gateway to vices and less than pure activities, which in turn incensed Puritan Elizabethans. Elizabeth I herself was only willing to tolerate the actors in her country, known as common players, if they were sponsored by a wealthy aristocrat, otherwise they were subject to being arrested. However, despite his weighty education, Marlowe was still a cobbler's son, and if he didn't wish to go into the church, he had to have a career both for the dry periods where he wasn't paid as a spy and as a cover for his other activities. He was a talented writer. The stage was a place he could project his own ideas about academia, religion, and social hierarchy, and it paid well. The local clergy would earn about £10 a year, but a new play could pay £6 each time. There is some suggestion Christopher may even have had another career, that of a tutor to none other than Arbella Stewart. She was a descendant of Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, and a possible heir to Elizabeth's throne. In 1589, she had a tutor named Morley, a known variation Marlowe used of his name, and her guardian, the Countess of Shrewsbury, spoke of how this Morley had hoped for an annuity of £40 from Arbella on account of having lost that much by leaving the university. This could account therefore for some of his absences from Cambridge before this date, and it's also possible he was here in the capacity of a spy. Arbella was a niece of Mary Queen of Scots and the cousin of James VI of Scotland, so it would be useful to have someone close to her. Plus, there is little evidence of any other known Morley from that time with a master's degree who wasn't already working. However, there is evidence against this theory. There are legal documents which place Marlowe in London between September and December 1589, namely in which he was involved in an argument between his neighbours, including one William Bradley, and Marlowe's friend, the poet Thomas Watson. They ended up in a fight and Bradley was killed. Marlowe ended up in Newgate prison for a fortnight, but at Bradley's inquest, the coroner recorded a verdict of self-defence. He was released on bail on the 1st of October and he was acquitted on the 3rd of December. But while in prison, he made the acquaintance of someone who might have helped get him in trouble with the law again, only this time it may have been in the service of his country. While at Newgate, he met John Buell, a Catholic imprisoned in 1587 on suspicion of coinage, or counterfeiting coins. Christopher's whereabouts are then somewhat unknown until 1591, when he was noted as writing plays in a chamber shared with Thomas Kidd, another dramatist. Then, the following year, in February 1592, Marlowe was arrested in Flushing, now called Vlissingen, in the Netherlands for counterfeiting coins. This was off the back of an accusation from another spy, Richard Baines, who claimed Marlowe had turned Catholic and intended to go to Rome, although he himself had been involved in the counterfeiting with Christopher and a goldsmith named Gilbert Gifford. It seems possible that there was some connection between Marlowe meeting a Catholic counterfeiter, his disappearance from public view for a few years, and his surfacing in Vlissingen may all be connected. The whole thing has the smell of an undercover attempt to flush out Catholic criminals. But Baines also claimed they had only minted 1 Dutch shilling, and that it was done out of mere curiosity with no intent to circulate them. The governor of the town, Sir Robert Sidney, backed this up by admitting the coin was of very poor quality and would have been unlikely to pass for a real one. Baines had apparently felt guilty the next day and decided to drop himself and his accomplices right in it. But Marlowe, when questioned, said something interesting. Not only did he accuse Baines of being the one who wanted to go to Rome, but he dropped 2 names: Ferdinando Stanley, Lord Strange, and Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland. As for Northumberland, he was praised by many poets and writers for his philosophical and scientific leanings, and he was very connected to Sir Walter Raleigh, who had an alleged school of atheism. Marlowe was indeed also connected with Lord Strange, as the nobleman owned a company of players known as Lord Strange's Men, who often performed in Marlowe's plays. Nevertheless, Stanley was known for being both of royal and Catholic blood, and he was a figurehead for Catholic exiles to the continent. This made his group a target for English spies, and it's possible this was how Marlowe was involved. Whatever the case, he was shipped back to England and Lord Burleigh, who released Marlowe without any charge. So, what might have happened here? It seems possible that both Baines and Marlowe were sent to Vlissingen to infiltrate the group of Catholics connected to Sir William Stanley, Lord Strange's cousin, and a known Catholic plotting against Elizabeth. If this is true, then both Marlowe and Baines were supposed to get deeper into the enemy's camp, making Baines's confession very odd indeed. Did he blow the operation because he suspected Marlowe really was going to the enemy? But then there are also theories that any of Marlowe's supposed leanings, be that atheism or Catholicism, were all for show due to his work. We may never know the true answer, but Christopher was certainly free by May, suggesting there was some involvement with the English government for his visit. He was taken into custody again on the 9th, this time for threatening a constable and a beadle. The dramatist was forced to enter into a bond, in which he promised to keep the peace towards the two men or pay a £20 fine. The records don't mention why the incident happened, but he was ordered to appear at the next session of the piece in early October, although this never happened. And this was because Marlowe was in court again, this time for a different altercation. In Canterbury on the 15th of September, he got into a fight with a tailor, and to make this worse, he was probably arrested by his own father, who was then acting constable of Westgate in the city. He only didn't end up in jail due to the main prize of 12p being paid for him, probably also by his father. The case came to court in October, but the tailor and Christopher appeared to have settled their differences and no further action was taken, meaning Marlowe once again escaped a jail sentence. Further criticism came in the form of Green's Groatsworth of Wit, a collection of writings by Robert Greene, edited and published after his death by playwright Henry Chettle. Within these, Marlowe was targeted as having said, "There is no God," and of being guilty of diabolical atheism, and agreeing with pestilent Machiavellian policy. Chettle said he had actually omitted much of the attack on Christopher's character, and as historian Charles Nicholl points out, this could mean he went further with Marlowe's apparent atheism, or even with his rumoured homosexuality. At the same time, Catholic propaganda was distributed about Sir Walter Raleigh's supposed school of atheism, and many of those mentioned to take part were friends of Christopher's. No doubt he too was suspected to be amongst them. It was also around this time in 1572 that Christopher wrote what was probably his most overtly political play, The Massacre of Paris. Just a few months earlier in August, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre had taken place in Paris, and its horrors were still etched in the minds of English Protestants everywhere. Canterbury especially received a large intake of Huguenot refugees, so this would have had a great impression on Marlowe as he wrote. Lord Strange's men performed the play in January 1593, and it was probably the last of his plays that Christopher would have had a chance to see in person. His final play is accepted to have been Edward II. Aside from its obvious themes of homosexuality and portraying the usually disliked king in a more sympathetic light, it also borrowed a few lines from Shakespeare's Henry VI. The two men both wrote plays for the same company, both lived in Shoreditch, and were both talented. There's no doubt they probably knew of each other and actually met, although neither would make this explicit until about 7 years after Marlowe's death. In Henry VI itself, many of the characters take on speeches that allude to Marlowe's characters in both The Jew of Malta and Tamburlaine. Further to this, Edward II may also have been a nod to James VI of Scotland and his relationship with his favourite, the Earl of Lennox. Marlowe's very final work is Hero and Leander, a narrative poem based on the 6th century Greek poem of the same name, although it would remain unfinished. In March 1593, there was a renewed vigour in hunting down Catholics, the Queen creating a royal commission explicitly for this purpose. On the 5th of May, an inflammatory and racist poem was posted on the wall of the Dutch churchyard on Broad Street in London, which became known as the Dutch Church Libel. It was a violent poem, full of slurs against foreign people in the city, Jewish communities, and immigrant traders. But it was written by someone who clearly admired Marlowe, as it used his iambic pentameter, was signed Tamburlaine, and used lines from his plays such as, "We'll cut your throats in your temples praying, not Paris massacre so much blood did spill." The authorities took notice, and the next day, Christopher's friend Thomas Kidd, another playwright, was under arrest. In Kidd's room, they found a 3-page transcript from Proctor's Fall of the Late Arian, which they identified as heretical papers denying the evidence of Christ. Kidd then said the papers were in fact not his own, but Marlowe's, from when they had shared a room writing together. The papers had got mixed in with his own, and Marlowe held at least one of the views written in the document. But his accusation went further. He claimed that Christopher had made jokes about the scriptures, including one in which he said St. John and Jesus loved one another with an extraordinary love, meaning that he was joking they had slept together. Having said this, poor Thomas revealed all of this under horrific torture at Bridewell Prison. How much was true, or at least embellished, we will never know. A warrant for Marlowe's arrest was issued on the 18th of May, and interestingly, they knew he would probably be found at Thomas Walsingham's house, whose father was a cousin of the late Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster. However, by the 20th of May, Christopher was found, but he was allowed to go out on bail, albeit under intense watch of the authorities. Once again, this suggests, especially given that Thomas Kidd was interrogated and tortured, Marlowe had some usefulness if he was free or had friends in high places. His supposed blasphemy was bad enough, but it was corroborated by none other than the Richard Baines who had worked alongside him in Flushing just a few days later. Baines compiled a list of 17 charges against Marlowe, of his apparent atheism and views on religion, from a speech the dramatist had apparently given at Sir Walter Raleigh's house. It included views on the fact that classical authors had been writing for thousands of years before Adam was apparently created, that Christ was a bastard and his mother dishonest. And worst of all, it twisted a passage about St. John, saying that he was a bedfellow of Christ and leaned always in his bosom. He used him as the sinners of Sodoma. It was an incredibly damning document, and weight was added against Marlowe by the fact that Kidd had separately said similar things. Or there may be another interpretation, that of an orchestrated campaign against Marlowe and possibly Walter Raleigh as well. Baines could easily have been told about Kidd's confession, and on top of this, another government spy, Thomas Drury, claimed in a letter he had a hand in producing and acquiring the note. On the 30th of May, Christopher was guest of a meal given at the home of Eleanor Bull in Deptford, along with Ingram Fraser, Nicholas Scares, and Robert Poley. This was no tavern, as is often incorrectly stated, but a manor house. Fraser and Scares were clients of Thomas Walsingham, and Poley was employed by Lord Burleigh and specialised in protecting the Queen. The three were used to working together in a team, and Scares had once also worked for the government. In other words, it was a strange gathering to put together, especially with the fact Marlowe was currently under suspicion of plotting against Elizabeth I, and Poley was a man responsible for sniffing out anyone who wanted to kill the Queen. The men dined together, then in the afternoon they walked around the garden together. They returned to the house at 6 p.m. and had supper together. Afterwards, Marlowe laid down on a couch and his companions were still seated at the table. Knowing that Eleanor's house was not a tavern suggests that perhaps this was a private party, and this would still require a bill at the end. Fraser and Marlowe got into an argument over the amount, which quickly grew heated. Apparently, Marlowe leapt up from the couch, grabbed Fraser's dagger and struck him on the head twice. The two men fell to blows, and in the struggle, Fraser grabbed his dagger back and stabbed Marlowe just above his right eye. The wound was fatal and Marlowe died instantly, probably of a brain hemorrhage. He was only 29 years old. The coroner found that Fraser had acted in self-defence, and he was given a royal pardon only 4 weeks later. On the 1st of June, Marlowe was laid to rest at the Church of St. Nicholas in Deptford in an unmarked grave. The main problem with the story is that all three of the witnesses were suspicious due to their work and the fact they often worked together. There were some holes in their story too. Fraser reckoned he had been unable to get away from Marlowe's attack and therefore had no choice but to kill him to save himself. But if that was the case, how did he manage to get hold of his dagger? Not only that, but the report suggested Marlowe had merely used the blunt handle of the dagger to hit into Fraser's head, meaning he just meant to hurt him but not kill him. And what happened to Skeers and Poley? Why did they apparently just sit and watch the drama unfolding rather than stopping the fight? One of the suggestions for Marlowe's death is that this was sanctioned by the Elizabethan government itself, possibly with the full knowledge of the Queen. Everything leads back to the palace in some way. After his arrest and bail, Marlowe had to check in every day with the palace. Baines's note ended up in government hands, apparently helped by a government spy, and Poley was responsible for the safety of the Queen. Possible motives if this was a murder could have come from Marlowe's apparent atheism, given that in 1593 Parliament upheld that heresy in atheism was tantamount to treason. Perhaps he had friends in high places who kept helping him out of jail, and many knew it would simply keep happening. So the decision was made to put Marlowe out of the picture permanently. It was also possible because of his double involvement with both Sir Walter Raleigh and his supposed atheist group and the government, Marlowe came to know of Robert Devereux's plots against Raleigh. When he was warned to stay silent and refused, he was permanently silenced. There is one further fringe theory, somewhat romantic, that in fact Fraser and the others helped Marlowe fake his death and escape. There is no evidence for this, and it's extremely unlikely. As with much of Marlowe's life, although we have a version of events to follow, there remain many other possibilities cloaked in shadow. In the aftermath of his death, Christopher Marlowe was remembered by his fellow playwrights and writers as an influential artist, and was admired by many, although others still wanted to distance themselves from him. Dramatist George Peele personified Marlowe as Marley, the Muse's darling. Poet and playwright Ben Jonson praised Marlowe's mighty line, one of the first to acknowledge his powerful verses. In Shakespeare's As You Like It, he not only used one of Marlowe's lines from Hero and Leander, but his character Touchstone also says, "When a man's verses cannot be understood, nor a man's good wit seconded with the forward child understanding, it strikes a man more dead than a great reckoning in a little room." This has been taken to indicate the reckoning, or bill, the men supposedly fought over in a little room, as well as this connecting back to lines from his plays. Christopher Marlowe is an enigma, a man made up of many characters. He was a studious scholar who toiled at his work to better himself, a patriotic spy working for the safety of his country, a possible double agent with ideas against Protestantism, an atheist playing everyone off against each other, a talented playwright who thrilled audiences of the day. Underneath the clever verses and big ideas woven into his works, Marlowe was a deeply troubled and complex person, always seeming to be on the knife edge of everything, reckless at all times. But he was also a man created by the times in which he lived. Changing religion possibly made him wary of it altogether, and there was social mobility as long as someone was academically clever enough. In short, Marlowe is a mystery. But going by the questioning nature of his plays and apparent open-mindedness, he would probably like that. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.